Hello, and welcome to Unit 6 of the 2005 Technology, Innovation, and the Civil War course. I'm Dr. Nick Sambaluk. It might sound funny to suggest that the shovel was an instrument of innovation in the Civil War. After all, entrenchments were a fairly regular part of sieges since at least the 17th century revolution in fortress building. In the tradition of the French engineer Vauban, trenches allow the protected worker toward building protected places for siege guns to batter down a fort's walls. This, in turn, would compel the defender to eventually surrender. The knowledge that this inevitable outcome will emerge, given enough time and resources on the besiegers' part. But the Civil War saw significant changes in how entrenchments were generally used. And so we do indeed see innovation involving the shovel. The American introduction to battlefield entrenchment came from West Point engineering instructor Dennis Hart Mahan, whose son Alfred Thayer Mahan became a notable naval theorist at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s. Mahan emphasized the advantage of active defense, a trench system that would allow the repulse of an enemy attack and then the quick transition into a counterattack that would inflict a second defeat upon the enemy. So it's defense for the purpose of then launching some sort of attack. But in actual experience in the Mexican War, U.S. officers were not very impressed by the potential of trenches. When the Crimean War broke out in 1854 in just south of Ukraine in Europe, it was characterized by the prolonged siege of the Crimean port of Sevastopol. 3 U.S. officers were dispatched to study and observe the action of the war, but the French put up so much red tape that the 3 officers, a major of engineering, a major of ordnance, and a captain of cavalry, the last of whom was named George McClellan, arrived after the siege had already ended. Nonetheless, while the U.S. Engineer officer was not much impressed, Captain McClellan was. He remembered the evidence of the Anglo-French efforts when, in 1862, he attempted to capture the Confederate capital by landing on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, entrenching and eventually gradually besieging the defending forces under Brigadier General John Magruder and General Joe Johnston backward toward Richmond. To buy time, Magruder and Johnston dug in, though it was clear that they were working a delaying effort rather than actually stopping McClellan's advance. After Johnston's wound ended his command of the main Confederate force in the Eastern Theater, General Robert E. Lee of Virginia, commanding the Virginia State Army, was transferred to command the main Confederate force in the Eastern Theater. Initially, Lee too dug in to defend. If Lee was reluctant to take a defensive posture, his troops were even more unhappy. Behind his back, they called him Granny Lee because of his age, although he was just 53 when the war began, and that's really not very old for a general officer by modern standards, certainly. And more bitingly, he was known as the King of Spades, a pun on his use of picks, shovels, and spades, digging implements for this defensive posture. You'll recall from Joe Glather's earlier work that McClellan was forced out of the Yorktown Peninsula more because Lee's aggressiveness intimidated him than because of Confederate tactical successes on the peninsula during that campaign in 1862. The end of the Peninsular Campaign brought a new trend to the war: the making of entrenchments to retain a field position after a battle. It sounds very counterintuitive to dig in for protection after the battle has finished, but we should remember that soldiers and generals cannot always know at the time whether a battle is over or if instead there's merely been a pause in the fighting. Also, it is useful to remember that the implements for digging were not standard issue. When, for example, Confederate Colonel Daniel Harvey Hill was defending against Brigadier General Benjamin Butler's campaign to seize the town of Big Bethel on the Yorktown Peninsula in April 1862, Hill's force had only 34 digging implements for his regiment. Now, a regiment is an Army unit with a theoretical strength of about 1,000 men. And between that whole organization, 34 picks and shovels. So that will naturally inhibit digging defensive installations if there really aren't the tools with which to do it. Finally, many commanders were reluctant to dig in because establishing a defensive position seemed likely to them to rob an army of its offensive spirit. Trenches would make it safer, in the short term anyway, to stay and defend rather than to attack and repel an invasion and end a threat in the long term. One of your readings for this unit addresses experimentation with rocket ordnance, and it's worthy of attention. The Peninsular Campaign witnessed early uses of some exotic weapons. One, which Butler personally fired with some enthusiasm. We remember Butler from just a moment ago. One that Butler fired personally was a Union prototype machine gun invented by a man named Wilson Agar. It was commonly referred to as the coffee mill because of the crank and the ammunition hopper at the rear of the gun, which resembled coffee grinders of the time. The ammunition was gravity-fed, either as a paper cartridge or an early steel cartridge bullet. A crank moved a cam that would alternatingly slam into a bullet's percussion cap and then lever that steel cylinder out if need be, if it was firing steel cartridge rounds, and allow the next bullet to fall into place. Firing up to about 120 rounds a minute, it could lay down a significant fire. Remember that a trained infantryman with a percussion cap rifle musket can fire about 3 times in a minute, 4 if things are going really well, but more like 3 rounds a minute. This Agar gun, a coffee mill grinder gun, could fire 120 rounds a minute. However, like most early innovations, there will be bugs to work out. The gun needed to rest on a light artillery carriage. So it's not an infantry weapon in the conventional sense. The gun has some limited mobility. Also, troops manning the gun necessarily made prominent targets because they had to stand up and feed ammunition in and crank the weapon and kind of aim it through guesstimation. They were also particularly good targets if the gun was jammed, which was a decided possibility. Additionally, this is an important one, since guns still fired black powder, and indeed we won't see a military weapon, a standard issue military weapon anywhere in the world firing smokeless powder until the 1880s, the gunner's view would be obscured very quickly. Firing 120 rounds a minute of black powder, there's going to be a lot of smoke generated, and it's going to be very hard to see targets very soon after starting to fire the weapon. Finally, the gun was a novelty, and it was expensive. Buying more Agar machine guns meant not being able to buy something else that the Army might need, like horses, or food, or blankets, or bullets. The Gatling gun, far more famous than the Agar, did not actually really see combat in the Civil War. It was under development during the period, but was not fielded by combat troops. An improved version in 1862 was under study and a few were purchased at the end of the war. Two were in fact used by the United States Army in Louisiana during Reconstruction to intimidate Klansmen who seemed interested in overthrowing the Reconstruction government of the state of Louisiana. The notable aspect of the Gatling is the system for rotating barrels, facilitating the loading process and especially cutting down on barrel overheating. In weapons such as the modern minigun, barrel rotation remains an effective way to permit very high rates of fire without damaging the gun as it shoots. By May 1862, Johnston's troops were still being pushed back by McClellan's methodical advance. 5 Union soldiers were killed and a dozen wounded by new and, quote, infernal machines. A landmine had come to warfare. On his own initiative, Brigadier General Gabriel Rains, Confederate officer, had installed a number of explosive charges in discreet and hidden locations. Sometimes they were buried in a road or were rigged to explode on the porch of an evacuated building when the pressure of a man's foot compressed a house's wooden planks. Percussion caps or strings attached to weights were the preferred triggering system. McClellan condemned the new weapon, especially because it was hidden and left behind during a battle. Neither side saw a problem with having explosive charges installed just in front of an actively defended field work, but leaving scattered land torpedoes behind seemed random and immoral. On that point, Confederate Joe Johnston actually agreed with his enemy. Johnston learned of the use of mines in mid-May, over a week after their first use on his behalf. Johnston learned of this not from his own subordinates, but from a report in the New York Herald newspaper. Censure by Confederate General Johnston and by Confederate Secretary of War George Randolph largely foreclosed the use of landmines during the Civil War, although Rains would continue to build torpedoes, mines, for use in harbor defenses along the Confederates' extended coastline and on their vulnerable rivers. After a poor performance as a field commander in the Battle of Seven Pines in 1862, Rains would work only in administrative positions and in building explosives for the remainder of the war. After the Peninsula, landmines would be used on 8 other occasions in the entire 3 remaining years of the war, so it's a very rarely used weapon. After the initial shock, also, Union troops learned to cope with mines through a combination of wary eyes and the use of small flag markers to identify danger. This is the first time that we see minefields being recognized and marked out to be avoided. So, our question today is, what prompts planners and soldiers to embrace potential innovations? Given the course material so far in the semester, what is the driving force behind Confederate attempts at innovation in the war? See you next time.